Well, good afternoon or morning, wherever you're at. And thank you for joining us here at Unitix Not Politics Presents and our monthly forum on race and politics. So good day, and again, appreciate your presence today. So today we're going to continue the conversation that we started over the past couple of months, and specifically going to follow up on the cultural conditioning conversation that we started last month. We titled today's topic Grappling with History. And to set this up, what I want to talk about is something that we're all seeing playing out in the news. Of course, as we continue to see the protests play out across America, one of the features of some of those protests that we've seen have come with some destruction of property. Now, some of that has been directed at statues and cultural icons and things that are associated with, at least in ostensibly to the protesters who are out there with these ideas of racism and past racism and white privilege. However, as we know, not all of the destruction has focused on that. So we want to talk a little bit about that because the criticisms around that, this idea that what it led to was a conversation and what should be a national conversation around should we remove icons that are prevalent in our society today that for some appear to be offensive. Statues that are, for instance, would seem to honor segregationists or some of the separatists from the South in the Civil War, the Confederate flag, and even now there's still some discussion about renaming military bases across America that have been named after Confederate heroes. So that's really a big discussion, and there's a lot to it. So to set that up, I want to talk about some of the narratives that you hear on both sides, and then we'll open it up to our panel to discuss some of these issues. Because the idea, on one hand, if you listen to the progressive narrative, so the narrative coming from the left spectrum, the idea is that, well, these are icons celebrating some of the most shameful episodes in our nation's history. That, for instance, in the case of, for instance, Fort Bragg, that we're talking about a Confederate so-called hero who wasn't a particularly good soldier and really is being celebrated because of his leadership in the Confederate Army. And so that these are really icons to white supremacy and racism, and so should be erased. That's the narrative that you would hear coming from the left. When we listen to the narrative that would come from the right spectrum, it clearly has a completely different point of view, and that is that while certainly acknowledging some of the difficulties in the history of some of these people and some of the associations with some of the icons, such as the Confederate flag, what they are really saying is that these things are not really celebrating those darker sides, but are celebrating some of the other more positive aspects of those things, and more importantly, are symbols of our history, our national history, and therefore removing these things really isn't solving a problem of racism, but rather removing these things is really hiding ourselves from our own history and in effect erasing history. And that erasing history in and of itself is a dangerous concept. Erasing history is an idea that we've seen totalitarian regimes, for instance, use as when they come in to shape the ideas of the current generation by shaping what we think about the past. And so, this idea that we may be erasing history can be seen as just as destructive, if not more so, than the ideas that we're seeking to erase by removing those icons. So you see two different perspectives. And as always, the Unitix perspective is something a little bit different, because the idea is that this concept that it is either this or that, this whole idea that there has to be a binary win-lose solution to these kind of discussions, we think is the fundamental flaw in how we're approaching these things. I mean, think about this when we go back. Let's take, for instance, we'll start with that the idea from the right that we're erasing history. I think it's pretty simple to dismantle and say that it's a pretty hypocritical idea to propose that we're erasing history while you're ignoring the history of why these were put up in the first place, because it's clear on the record as to why a lot of these were put up, and they were put up as reminders of and truly to celebrate some of the more despicable ideas that came out prior to the Civil War and that were supposed to be put behind us by that. So that was pretty easy. But then let's also take a look at the progressive point of view, because there's a lot of hypocrisy there as usual. When we talk about erasing history, when you look at what the Democrats are putting out there as that point of view and saying that we should be removing these icons because of their association with the past, I think it's a slippery slope when you think about that, because we're all human beings. And even if you look at some of those people who I think most of us would agree that regardless of where you stand politically, we should not be erasing those icons. Say, for instance, in Abraham Lincoln. On one hand, you have here's the author of the Emancipation Proclamation, and so arguably the architect of Black freedom in America and obviously emancipation from slavery. We won't talk about whether or not it actually freed anyone at the time, but the point is that clearly the result of what was put out there resulted in the emancipation of the slaves at the time. But at the same time, if you look at some of the reasoning, some of the statements that Abraham Lincoln made at the time, clearly out of step with how anyone would think, whether you're a progressive or a conservative, because it certainly didn't speak to the equality of Black people socially or intellectually, and Lincoln even floated ideas of, that maybe the best solution would be to remove Black people from America altogether. So how would you treat a legacy like that? Because it doesn't matter who or what point of view you pick, it's a mixed history. We're human beings. We're flawed and we're products of our time. So what progressives have to always remember is that all heroes are flawed, and that we all have aspects to us that can be shameful if looked at. And there is probably something that each and every one of us believes in today unconsciously, without even thinking about it, that will be out of step with the thinking of the future. And so therefore, we're all guilty of something. So it's something to think about, the whole idea that somewhere in the middle of these arguments is where we may find the solution. So with that, hopefully getting your thoughts going, and hopefully we'll start seeing some comments flowing in the chat. Certainly I'm looking to see someone challenge some of the ideas that I just threw out there. But let's start talking about our first question. But before we do that, let's bring on our panel. We're going to start with a regular who has been on our last couple of panels and certainly has some great ideas and a lot to say. Beth, you want to say hi?
Hey there.
All right, thank you for joining us. And we have a returning panelist from a previous. Mel, do you want to open up and say hello?
Myself.
All right.
So get on. Can you hear me?
Yeah, about halfway through that sentence, you kicked in there.
Sorry. Yeah.
It's fun on video conferencing.
It's almost like I haven't done this before, right? So, hey, I want to say hi. And thanks for having me back. I'll try to do my best to articulate both sides. So.
All right. Well, we're patient as well. Thanks for joining us again, Mel. Another returning panelist is Gabe.
Hey, everybody. Glad to be back. Also, articulate both sides as best as possible.
And there's a familiar face, and notice how quickly he was able to work those controls. I'm impressed. Everyone should be taking note. And last but by no means least, we have a new panelist on. Bootsy, you want to introduce yourself? I can see you, but I can't hear you yet, Bootsy. All right, we may be having some audio issues there, and I'm going to trust that our producers are jumping on that, and hopefully we'll get that corrected pretty quickly. I'll tell you what, while we're working on that, Bootsy, I'm going to go ahead and set up our first question, and get the conversation started. So you heard the introduction as I'm talking about destruction of statues that's happened with the protests that erupted ever since the murder of George Floyd. The focus of, as I mentioned, a lot of this damage were statues of slaveholders and other Confederate icons. These property attacks were justified in many cases by saying that the presence of the statues were just more evidence of the entrenched racism in American culture, while others saw this as an appalling attack on American history. So our first question is, there has been a demand that has gone out in public circles to remove all similar statues and to change the names of military bases that were named after Confederates. Is this a legitimate demand? And Beth, I'm going to throw this at you first.
Oh, okay. I think that it is not to coin a phrase, black and white. I happen to have, my family's been in this country long enough that I have ancestors on both sides of that. I actually have Confederate and Union ancestors. And so what I think is that it is a matter of context. So if we want to address the issue of not erasing history, then it's a matter of providing the context, the nuance that, because we're also not studying the Civil War as deeply as we need to right now. We're just saying this was over slavery, screw the wrong side, you know, and glorify the right side. But we don't look at things like how General Sherman, for example, treated the slaves that were following him, and the people in the North that were sending letters to their sons saying, we sent you to war to keep this Union together, not to free slaves, you know, desert and we'll get you a lawyer. I mean, so it's not as if one side was just completely right and the other side was completely wrong. And so what we need to do is make sure that we understand all of the things that happened in the Civil War, because we don't want those things to happen again. Then if we have these statues in some place, then we need to be able to say, this was erected, why? These people erected it, they did it to do this. Many of those were not erected right after the Civil War. They were erected in the 1918, the 20s, and they did so to intimidate Black citizens. So now we need a sign that says, this is why this was erected. This is what actually occurred. And we need to tell you what actually happened, why each state seceded, why people made the choice they did, and how it all turned out. Because if we're not educated completely in the entirety of why this occurred, then we don't know why any of it happened, and we can't use that knowledge as a tool to inform ourselves right now. So maybe, you know, we don't knock it down completely, but we do make sure that all of the information is available about what that person did on both sides. Ulysses S. Grant had slaves. And so I think it's important to know that it isn't completely black and white, and to make sure that knowledge is available to everybody.
Thoughts, team?
I mean, I think it's a legitimate request, but that same thing is, it has to sort of, what channels does that go through? Who decides what things come down and what not? You know, if we're talking about riots and things like that, and people just tearing down statues, you could really make an argument for a lot of things, because people have different agendas. You know, you could have, even if there's 100 rioters, right? And I'm just talking specifically like rioters, not necessarily protests, people destroying property. It's like, where do you find that line between protest and sort of violent behavior? And I'm just calling tearing down statues violent right now. right? So who's to say that they don't go to burn down like a Wells Fargo or something like that and say, well, this company doesn't align with values that we're talking about, or this company over here is founded in racism and things like that. Why don't we burn all of these down? I think there needs to be sort of a process and a procedure. And also, I like the idea, Beth, of saying this is why this was erected. Let's sort of talk and have that discussion. But then that also begs the question of where these things are located, and who wants them there. I mean, it's a whole open discussion about what's right and what's wrong, but and I'm sure we'll get into some of that. But just the question of, okay, there are going to be people who are extremely racist, and they're like, yes, I am. That's my thing. I believe in this. I believe my race of whatever it is a supreme race, and this is a statue that sort of represents that to me and this community. Like, if everybody in that community agrees, then do people have a right to demand that be taken down? So I think it's a very interesting kind of question. Is it a legitimate demand? Yeah. But how do we go about, and what's the procedure of taking some of these things down or erecting them?
Well, let me bring the audience into this, because I see a question in the panel that I think is, in the chat that I think is should be posed out here. So Bootsy, I'm going to throw this out at you. When you look at, for instance, Germany, we don't see that they're maintaining statues there to Adolf Hitler, right? When you look at the Soviet Union, you see that when they changed over, they were very quick to tear down statues of Stalin, for instance, and Lenin. When you look at it in that context, I kind of pose it out there again. Does it make sense that we would continue to have statues up and call it history that are dedicated to Confederate heroes?
So I am one of those people that believes that when you have that type of imagery, whether it be statues or, the flying of the Confederate flag, those type of things, they elicit a certain type of response from people who feel like those are oppressive symbols. And, like Beth had said earlier, those things were put up during, Jim Crow era, and mostly. And, that they are used and most times as an intimidation type of thing. They were put in public squares, not just like honoring the dead soldiers and things that they put up in the cemeteries, but they were put in public squares as a notification that, you need to remember this. And so in that context, the history that they're trying to remind people of can be looked up as being antagonistic. And so, you understand that Germany has torn down statues, or didn't erect statues and things of, Nazi leadership, and the same with Russia and all those things. I do think that there is room to discuss those things with the people who feel like that those are, symbols of oppression. And to speak about Gabe's point about, not just going out there and just tearing down things arbitrarily because, somebody thinks that this is wrong to be out there, but to have it really be, something that is brought to debate and then, you know, have some sort of legal procedure that that they go through to in order to, you know, vote whether to take something down or not.
All right, but let me just ask this question again to the panel, because I feel like sometimes maybe we culturally talk out of both sides of our mouth. Because on one hand, we're saying here that, yeah, we should, you know, we should tear these things down. And I'm looking in the chat, and seems to be a lot of support for, you know, especially around that argument that you don't see statues to Hitler in Germany and, you know, the stuff I just said. But on the other hand, you know, when you go to Poland, a lot of the people are supportive of the idea of keeping, for instance, the old concentration camps still open in their museums now. And what more offensive symbol of oppression could there be than the gas chambers at Auschwitz, or some of the other more notorious. I mean, come on. What more offensive thing? And yet the idea there is we have to keep these things up, because if we remove them, we really are erasing history, and we want to make sure. So we seem to agree culturally that in that case, it is erasing history if we were to remove these. And yet in our own case here in this country, tearing down a statue or, you know, burning a Confederate flag or getting rid of them, those things we say are offensive. And we should be removing those. Isn't that hypocrisy?
I think they're very well. I think they're kind of different. You know, well, okay, they're not exactly different, but I think the difference is that context is completely provided in the concentration camps. So you don't go there to glorify the Nazis and think this is where the Nazis really kicked butt. I mean, you go there to weep and look at all of, and think of every one of the people who was forced to march through there to their own death. And so, yeah, I say with the statues, maybe take them out of the public square and put them in a place where you go to say, look, this is where, because part of the history is not just the statue, but the erection of the statue, the making of the statue, and the original context in which it was provided. So now you're looking at the spectrum of history and saying, this is when this happened, and this is why these people put it up. So this is the where all of these statues were put up to glorify the war of northern aggression, or whatever they're going to call it, right? But again, the issue is context. When you go to the concentration camps, nobody, not nobody, because you can't control what everybody thinks, but the overwhelming majority of the people that go there are not going there to look at that as a triumph of Nazis. They're going there to acknowledge this terrible atrocity that happened. And I think that there's a way to do that with these sculptures, and also to show like the self-glorification, you know, of these images. So I don't think they need to be in the public square anymore, because I don't think that they grace the area that they're in the way that they originally were intended to do. And it would be the question would be a little bit easier if there were more sculptures of people of color who had also achieved things. Then we might be able to have a little bit more balance. The fact is that there's no balance.
And I think there was you know, your statement, and there's a big difference between erecting a statue to honor somebody and the concentration camps that are designed to just remind people of what it was like. Very big difference, because it is not a monument. It's not making a statement that, oh, this is a great thing. I agree with what Beth was saying. No, it you know, having been to Germany and seeing it is, it's like the Black Museum that we have here, and you know, it is to remind people of what it was like. Very different, not a glorification. I think also we have to remember too that, you know, now statues within itself are, you know, they aren't bad. it's what they represent that makes it, you know, reprehensible in the case of some of the statues that have been taken down. And some people who have lived with these statues, having been to the South and seeing some of these statues, you know, no one looks at a statue and says, oh, hey, you know, that person, and looking at the history, all that statue does, it just reminds you of just how heroic that person is. And that's why I think that they need to be taken down, because, as Beth also pointed out, one, doesn't represent everyone, and also it's a lie, you know. It's no, you know, and what country immoralize or erect a statue against their enemy, you know? And so
I think this brings up an interesting sort of question, right? Because we kind of compare the statues here, slavery, to statues of like Hitler, if there was some. But there's a very, I think, big difference between what people think are right and wrong, and how history is carved. I think if you talk to most people and say, was the Holocaust a good thing or a bad thing? They would go, that's terrible. It was terrible. And you can kind of link that back to one person, right? Hitler is synonymous with the Holocaust, right? Same thing with Stalin or Pol Pot, or, you know, these different people who had a major role in sort of genocide. But you go back to slavery. If you go to the South today, there are still people who call it the war of Northern aggression. You know, it's divided as to what the Civil War really was. And there's, so I think there's a very big difference kind of about, oh, let's leave up the concentration camps in Auschwitz and stuff like that, because people can learn that this was wrong, but you still have people reenacting the Civil War. And people, when we have these discussions about slavery and history, right, here is, it's very divided in the views. Oh, that was a long time ago. They sort of people who say that was a long time ago and it doesn't really have any bearing today, much so. There's a lot of people out there that believe that we've moved on from slavery, like, and so these discussions are different. So I kind of put out to the panel, isn't there a very big difference between how people view some of these monuments to people here, as opposed to comparing it to a very clear-cut, for lack of a better term, thing as the Holocaust or some of those genocides, a dictatorship?
but why put it to the panel? I mean, not to take
Everybody,
you know,
everybody.
Greer. Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, you said to the panel. I panicked there for a moment. Okay, fine. Just checking. Not trying to do your job though.
You know what? I think I'm the moderator here, but
yeah, I said I apologize. That I'm not.
Fortunately, I'm not territorial. You know, we have a comment from the audience. Bill Buford, do you want to comment?
I do. Can you hear me?
We can.
Excellent. Listening to both sides of this, both perspectives, I think what we're actually saying is that it's an incredibly fine line that we're walking when we say, should these representations be taken down, or should they remain for us to learn? It could be considered revisionism, okay, to revise history, for future generations to say, yeah, there's no statue of Robert E. Lee now. And they're going to go, well, who the heck was Robert E. Lee? See, the thing that gets me about all of this is that from a Southerner's perspective, and this is what I've been told after living, like 30 miles from Mobile, Alabama, that from the Southern perspective, it was economic more than the base of it was economic, so that they could continue to progress, grow cotton, and build wealth. As where from the Northern perspective, and I've had this comment made too, that Lincoln really wasn't trying to free the slaves. He was trying to protect the Union. So when we start talking about taking down statues, leaving statues, and putting it upon ourselves to decide the reasons, okay, it's a very, very fine line. Like Saddam Hussein, first thing that happened, his statues came down. Is that going to be taught in schools? That, so you see what I'm saying? Are we going to take down the statues and then make sure that everybody knows what happened? Or are we going to leave them and make sure that everybody knows what happened?
Interesting question. So, panel?
Well, as far as I know, the Civil War is standard curriculum across America, and they could do a better job of explaining both sides of it and who the major combatants were and the people that were involved in it. But by removing a statue from a public location, it isn't revising history at all, because there's always the ability for them to just remove the statue and put it in a place where it can have its proper context, like a museum. And according to I was reading something about a study that was done in 2016, and it said that over 700 of the Confederate statues and symbols, they were in public places, public squares. So when you go downtown, you might have to go downtown. You don't have a choice on whether or not you're seeing these things that may lead you to have some adverse sort of reaction to them. You know what I mean? Like I said, a lot of these things are viewed by a lot of people as antagonistic. And, people can argue the validity of them, their purpose for being put up in the first place, but you can't tell a person how a vision of something makes them feel. It's just how they make them feel. So when we're talking about things that are in public places, then, people have a right to be able to voice their opinion on whether something should be there or not.
Other thoughts?
Well, I think we have continuously, when you go into a town and there's a bunch of statues that are of white men who were on the side of the conflict that was fighting for slavery, it is arguable that both things that people say about the Civil War are correct, that it was about states' rights and that it was about slavery. The fact is that the right that they were arguing about was slavery, which taints the argument for states' rights. If the state right that everybody was going to war for was gay marriage, it would be a little bit clearer to us today why states' rights are important. But because the state, with the right that they were fighting for was slavery, it has tainted this argument deeply and sort of invalidated the states' rights position. So now what we look at is like, yeah, you wanted to keep slaves. And we have to acknowledge that. And that means that when people of color go into this town, what they are seeing is this town where only the white people were making the decisions about what went up in the public square. Only the white people were deciding what part of history they wanted to acknowledge. And it's one more place that we have said, okay, well, we've sort of stopped doing that to you guys, to you people of color. So why can't you just get over this now? And why can't, instead of, we refuse to make any concessions toward, you know, any kind of reparation, but we'd like for you to just like get over the fact because we've stopped. As opposed to saying, how is this making you feel that you're walking into this town where there are no monuments that look like you? There are no monuments. I mean, okay, so we have the Arthur Ashe statue in South Carolina, right? I can't remember, is it Charlotte? Anyway, and that's like a, yeah, where's Harriet Tubman? I mean, where's all these people that, so we need to acknowledge that yes, that right now it still looks like only the white people are calling the shots here. And I mean, that's already revisionist history. I mean, we're already only writing the history the way we saw it and not really acknowledging all of the other things and all of the other context. And I believe that at this point, we have to acknowledge that there's a significant amount of the population that doesn't want to see that stuff. And if they do want to see that stuff, again, I do believe education is so important. I don't believe that we should erase the Civil War any more than I think we should erase any part of our history. I believe that thorough education is so important, no matter what we're talking about, like to make information available so that every person can understand it deeply and make decisions and be able to be conversant on it. We are losing the history of this country. And half of it was already erased to begin with because it was written by the winners. And so it's really important now for us to rewrite, which is, I guess, revising, but I mean, we need to rewrite the other half of it and then teach it deeply and show these images. And, you know, the images of Robert E. Lee, you know, on his horse looked pretty glorious in 1920, but it kind of looks self-aggrandizing to me now. And so, again, put that in a museum where we say, look at all the white guys who were fighting for slavery and look how proud they were of that. That is not flattering anymore, but it is information. And we as a country, I think we're in a terrible position right now in our country specifically because of that, because we do not have all of the information about our own history. And so we're not making educated decisions. We need so much to take care of educating ourselves, of making more information available. More information is never the wrong answer. So that's what I think.
I think, Beth, I think that there is information out there. It's just you have to dig for it. There's a great documentary that I recently watched, and it's called "The Truth About the Confederacy." The Truth About the Confederacy. And I think people should look at it because it talks just about some of the things that we're talking about now. And I find it quite fascinating because it talks about statues and why do we have them and that sort of, and the reason that they were erected. All right, I throw out an idea also is that, you know, with regards to these statues, and we talk about tearing them down, but another idea is, why not let why not let the states determine what statues should be up and what shouldn't be, and maybe not, and maybe add, you know, statues that do depict the truth about America. You know, I mean, you know, about slavery and the Harriet Tubmans, W.D. Du Bois, and some of them, and let states maybe erect statues side by side. And that way, maybe that might balance out some of the push, you know, of eradicating statues as opposed to let's just broaden it. That's from a social, a more broader perspective is how do you become inclusive as opposed to being um, to include people as opposed to uh, just saying, well, these statutes are bad. I think, repeating myself, I think maybe the states should probably make decisions as to what statutes they want. How do they want to be represented? Now that we become woke, I think um, that might be another way to go. And maybe I'm taking the discussion in a different direction, but I
I
apologize.
think
But
it
that's
might be an interesting direction that we might want to explore. We do have a comment from the audience, and Morland's been making some very good comments in our chat. So, Morland.
Well, actually, I was listening to you guys, and while you were talking, I guess one of the things I thought about, and I think it's a big thing with American history more so than any other, is I think a lot of times we do a disservice, especially Civil War, but almost with everything else. With, I guess, the other way to put it, the iconization and the symbols we throw out there that symbolize everything. And it's usually on a positive thing. So like when these statues were put there, you could argue the people that put them there, yes, they were there to intimidate, but it was also to celebrate their proud history. And I think a lot of times for us, when I look at our country in particular, how can I put this? We tend to not necessarily glorify, but we allow people to lose. So if there's a fight or a battle or whatever, usually at the end of it, there's a kind of like, well, no harm, no foul, or yeah, it was a rough fight, but then we moved on without actually examining, hey, wait a minute, there was a loser here. And that loser was so committed to this cause. Look at the horrible things that they did. We don't do that. It's just kind of like, well, let's just brush aside from that and move on. And I think one of the bad things about the study of history, or at least the way that it's taught, is, unless you go to higher education or college, or unless you're challenged on critical thinking in terms of, well, wait a minute, yeah, all these things happened, but you don't go from, this terrible situation to this great situation, or in terms of the lost cause or states' rights, well, what rights are we actually examining here? Can we actually take out the documents and look at them? I think that's when people's opinions start to change about, well, wait a minute, if that's the case, then why is this here and why was it placed there? But I think the bad thing is that we don't get to that point for a lot of people because they just see the statues. They see the symbolism, and it's kind of like 1 + 1 = 2 without actually examining the deeper meaning and the deeper things that go behind that. It's just like seeing a cross. Most people associate it with Christianity, but you don't necessarily associate it with, say, some of the bad things on the other side, like the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, or anything else. And I think with these statues, as well as a lot of other things, one of the disservices that I think pretty much us, all Americans, left, right, and everything else we've done, is to basically throw these things out there. And yeah, they were there for a reason, but just say, well, let them go ahead and have that because it means, something else to different people, rather than sitting there and spelling it out both sides and going through all of this and saying actually how complicated it was. I mean, Lee was a complicated individual, and a lot of them were, but we don't look, well, like I said, at a certain level, you don't get that. On one hand, it was like, yeah, Lee and, Confederacy and, and nobody stops anyone and says, hey, wait a minute, it's not about that, or it's not that simple. Because I think a lot of us just don't know that history. So that's it.
All right, comments?
Yeah, and I think that Moreland sort of brings up something about, you said something about the disservice of, history and stuff like that. I think a lot of subjects that are taught in school, like math, is pretty straightforward as to why we teach math. Science, at least the basis of science and the principles that go into the different sciences are pretty straightforward. Why do we teach history? When I was growing up, I felt more that history was almost to instill patriotism a lot of times, American history as I learned it. A lot of the books that, you know, the entire country buys is based off of what Texas buys, because it's the biggest sort of market and book publishers. So, but the problem with that is that politics kind of get infused as to what goes into those books. So the entire country being dictated, what people in Montana are learning, or Vermont or Maine, is dictated by maybe some of Texas's politics that went into what went into a history book, because it is the biggest market, and so that's what some of the country buys. So it leads the question to me is, what is the point of teaching history? I'm not saying that it's pointless, but like, what is the reason that we want that to, what are we trying to give our children? What are we trying to do with history? And so why do we teach?
You know, I think I'm going to do a little bit of a redirect here, because as I'm listening to a lot of the comments, there's starting to be some common threads that are coming out. So for instance, when I back up, I'm thinking, I'm hearing a couple of things, and one of the strongest things coming through is this idea of context. That really what's differentiating, for instance, the concentration camp from the statues here, and what differentiates one statue from another is really what context, what cultural ideas are we bringing to it behind. So, you know, I heard Beth talk once about, and I'm paraphrasing Beth, so I'm certainly not a quote, but she brought up this idea that really you can't control what someone brings in their mind when they come into a particular exhibit. And I think she said that when she was talking about what someone might be thinking when they go to the concentration camp, for instance. And so if this idea of context is so important, let's think about what the implication, and please challenge that if I'm misreading it, because that's what I'm hearing from a lot of people, and even some of Moreland's comments really talked about the context behind them. And so if I'm right, and that premise is true, that cultural context is what really is a differentiating factor between what makes a symbol offensive versus instructive, for instance, then think about also, and I'm reading kind of into Moreland's comments about cultural heritage, right? Because then now put yourself in the mindset of, say, a Southern white male who doesn't feel attachment to this idea of slavery or to racism, but yet at the same time, as most of us want to do, takes pride in their own background and heritage and their own ancestry and those things, and wants to continue doing so. When we start challenging the very idea of what these things may or may not represent, and we start putting our own context onto it and saying, this is the absolute what they represent, and so they must be removed, are we in essence trying to erase the cultural, forget not so much the history question, but are we trying to erase or challenging the cultural heritage of a large group of people?
Well, one of the things that you know, people say a lot of times, especially about like the Confederate flag and things like that, it represents their, you know, history, their Southern culture, the Dixie culture, and all those things. And while I will say that, yes, to some people, yes, that is exactly what that flag stands for. But, you know, again, it represents something else to other people, though. I read something about the state of Georgia. They redesigned their flag in backlash to the civil rights movement, and in 1956 was when they redesigned their flag to incorporate the Confederate flag into it. And you know, I think is South Carolina. They added the Confederate flag to the top of their Capitol building in 1962. And so this was, you know, these things and gestures were in direct retaliation to them opposing civil rights movements. And so when you look at it from that perspective, you know, it lends to the argument on the other side that, you know, that these are just being used as oppressive symbols. But I do believe that, you know, people should have the right to fly the Confederate flag on their, you know, on their property, or, you know, display it and all those different things or whatever. I mean, that's, you know, we all have different sports teams that we root for, and you know, and it's okay to put up a flag of that or whatever. Somebody might not like it, you know, especially in Colorado, people hate the Raiders, but, you know, feel free to fly your Raiders, you know, flag and things like that. But like I said, but when we're talking about public square, you know, in public settings and things like that, then that's where I kind of get that, where we need to have a certain standard that people have their say in, and that's what I think.
Are you a Raiders fan, Bootsy?
Yeah, you lost me with the Raiders comment, but
okay, let's start with okay. Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, we don't want to offend any Californians or, well, Las Vegans out there. You know, I still, you know, I'm still stuck on this idea of context, even in the comments that you just made, Bootsy. So I'm going to kind of throw this back out there again. And this time I'm going to wrap it up and kind of bring us back to comments that Melvin had made about, is it then a matter of not so much erasing or removing these? And this kind of ties in, I think, to some of the comments that maybe Bill had made about revisionism, when we remove certain statues but not others. So is it then something where we should look at bringing balance to the context, right? So Melvin's suggestion about possibly adding as opposed to subtracting to what we see in the public space.
Well, I think that adding to the public space would certainly bring about more discussions. I think everybody who certainly doesn't see a problem with a Confederate statue being up and is saying, what's the big deal, might suddenly have a different viewpoint if you know, put up a statue of Nat Turner. You know, so, but then it's, but I think that's the whole thing, is how do we take this context and have a discussion about it? And I think that is that's what we're trying to get to the bottom to. That's what we're trying to do with these talks and everything like that, is sort of have these open discussions. You know, how do we move forward? I think, Mel, you brought in a lot of good points about maybe states, but then what is the state's sort of responsibility for that stuff, and how do you hold those people accountable who should be in charge of that thing? Is that out to the people to see how important it is? You know, if there's one state that's like, well, we don't really care one way or the other, but some people do, is there policies and procedures out there that hold those people accountable?
Well, I don't think anyone's had that discussion other than on forums like this, where they talk about, well, let's see if we can, you know, come to some sort of compromise. I mean, is all the statues out there that they're tearing down, are they all bad? Are they all racist? Are they all, you know, Robert E. Lee, you know, is having a statue of Robert E. Lee bad as opposed to David Duke and his statue up? I mean, you know, I think that, you know, we're talking about, well, let's tear it down because it's all racist and stuff like that. But also, you know, we talked to, you know, sometimes a statue can be used as a reminder of what could be, you know, and I think, you know, it is worth discussing what would be the criteria to maintain a statue. I mean, I heard some of the what some of the people are saying and that sort of stuff. But it's too easy just to put a label and say, well, we should take it down, because we believe that it's racist. Just as much as if we erected a statue of Stokely Carmichael, and we could say, well, the things that he proposed was racist, as opposed to like Martin Luther King. I mean, which one would I want to have up? I guess what I'm saying is that if we let states make a decision, I mean, certainly would want to have a panel to decide on, if we're going to do this statue, then let's put it up for the right reasons. I don't know how that would look, but but it's worth discussing. We can't just, and the way that people are tearing down these statues, I think also is very disrespectful to the people who believed in them. And that is, late at night, they're just tearing down, what they deem as a negative. And I think, I think since the statues are up, I think that we could be more civil in terms of how we take them down. Because in that, there's a lesson to be learned.
Yeah, and you said this interesting thing about building statues for the right reasons, and that's a whole conversation, because if they were to erect something of Stokely Carmichael, who say, okay, well, this is leader of this movement over here, and then we go, okay, so it's good, it sort of represents this side of it, and then women come and say, well, a lot of things that Stokely was saying is incredibly misogynistic and problematic. So it goes to, again, that whole question of why the statues were erected in the first place. And it does kind of show that hypocrisy of both sides, because almost everybody, we're human, we're flawed, right? And who's to say where some people start aren't where they ended? That's why one of my favorite books is Autobiography of Malcolm X, is because I think from every sort of step in the way, there was this great progression of thought, and if we're open-minded and we continue to educate ourselves and have these conversations, of course we're going to sort of change perspectives and whatnot. So is erecting statues in the first place a good thing? But I do like the idea of just putting them in museums and stuff there.
Yeah, I agree. I agree that, in order to have the proper, context of any of these statues or memorials or any of those things, that the best place to put those would be in a museum. And then people are going there with intention of learning how those things fit into our history. And it's not, just thrown in their face where, they don't really have a choice on whether or not that they see them or not. And it's not destroying the history of it. It's putting history in a place where people can go to study the history. And also, I still believe that, that they should teach these things in school as a broader topic, and not just skim over it. And, there was a civil war fought against the North and the South over slavery. That it's a lot more complex than that. And they should really, teach kids so that they understand the, the totality of the whole war.
So I said all that to get to this point too. I think they should melt them all down myself. And the reason I say that is because, and this whole idea of putting them in a museum, that's just to appease some hurt feelings and stuff like that. But I don't think that the Ayatollah statue is stuck in some sort of museum. I think they destroyed it, and I think their premise is, I should preface this so I don't confuse everybody. I'm just telling you where I sit before I tell you where I stand. And so here's the problem with us putting them in a museum is we're still worshiping these people. People go to museums and say, oh, he's still a great leader. Well, that's bullshit. So, and I just think that when the people say, oh, hey, let's put him into a museum and stuff like that, I think they aren't a great work of art. They really aren't. So I want to put them in a museum, and they're a lie. So.
Well, I think that's going to be a very good segue. I think we're going to move on to a different question now. So great conversation. I think there's been a lot of talk, obviously, about this erasing history and about history itself, and that's kind of where you were there, Melvin, at the end. And so let's move on to a different question here, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this idea of history and specifically erasing history, because I think we've all heard that there are more direct efforts going on right now to alter how history is taught. And there's been a lot of discussion here on this panel about teaching of history and how history is taught. Well, it's been said, many times that history, and it's even been said on this call, that history is a fiction written by the victors, right? Because history is written by the victors. And I would say that history, maybe we could agree that history is for the most part a perception, right? It is what we see in a textbook is a single perception of interpretation of events that have been out there, and certainly there are other interpretations. And as evidence, if that weren't true, there really wouldn't be much of an industry in terms of publishing history books, right? It'd be one and done, and we'd all be reading Herodotus, for instance, instead of some of the things that we're reading today. So I think we all understand that history is an analysis. It's a human endeavor, unlike, for instance, say mathematics, and maybe this is my bias, in which wherever you go worldwide, 1 + 1 = 2. But not wherever you go worldwide does this point of view hold when we're talking about history. Things change depending upon who's telling history. So African Americans have charged that they've been shorted in American history for a long time. Their history was erased or at best reduced to a single data point called slavery, and that Black and African history have been largely ignored, or even worse, has been usurped in some cases. So this kind of brings us to efforts that are going on right now that are truly efforts to revise American history, at least is how it's taught. For instance, the New York Times has generated controversy with the 1619 Project, and that seeks to reframe all of American history around this question, around the idea of slavery and the contributions of African Americans. Are these efforts improving the scope and accuracy of American history and racial propaganda, or is it something in between?
I mean, I would say it's something in between. Again, I'm going to go back to the question of what is the purpose of teaching history, especially if it is so subjective to sort of the perspective of who is writing the history, And I don't know. I always I was in school a long time ago, so I'm hoping things have changed, but it was very clean cut and sort of nice, and the things that were atrocities sort of got skimmed over. And I don't know if that's just because we're trying to save children's innocence or whatnot, but it all seemed very positive for the most point. And if it wasn't positive, it was like, well, we did this and we learned from it, so this was necessary, or it was glorified. So the 1619 Project, I think these sort of come from good places, but what is the purpose of it? And this is honestly something I don't know. Who kind of gets together and goes, this is the history we need to teach? Because as I said, from what I know, it's very sort of political, and people go, oh, this is what I want put in this book. I have some money here, I'm going to fund and make sure that this gets put in this book. Maybe I didn't end on a good enough point to segue. So I was posing the
you caught
question,
everyone off guard.
Do I think that it's somewhere in the middle? Of course it's somewhere in the middle, you know. It's there's a talk about erasing history, but from what I'm hearing from us, from the panelists, from everybody, is we don't know what history is, you know. We are altering what somebody else thought history was. There are people who I think are great that other people think are jerks, you know. I'll take it back to what if someone was writing history and was fundamentally just going off of Hitler and his leadership abilities? You know, that would be drastically sort of different. That would be a very glorified sort of, yeah, all these bad things happened, but look at his leadership quality. And that may seem like a stretch, but you know, what I hear about all these historical things is like, okay, but these were great people for this reason. Well, I mean, you get that many people united behind you to do something that most people would consider an atrocity. It's like, all right, what are we looking at? What merits are we looking at? Morality kind of jumps into history at some point, you know. It's the same as we look at news right now. Some news isn't news, it's more commentary or trying to sway one way or another. It's very difficult to kind of find a news source that is, here is facts, here are facts, you interpret this as it goes. And from the history that I read, it wasn't written like that. It wasn't just, here are facts, here are the facts from many historians compiled. There's no sort of building anybody up or tearing anybody down. This is what happened. Again, I would love to read history books now, if I had enough time, to see what's going actually into schools. I just unfortunately know some of the negative things that are being taught in history currently.
Well, I think that when you're trying to pull something in a different direction, you tend to be extreme about the way that you're doing it. And so we're looking at one kind of history that has been weighted in one direction for a long time. And so now the 1619 project is one tiny thing that's like, can we just give this a yank? You know, and we tend to expect people of color to be conciliatory about the way you introduce your perspective into the greater context. So, you know, we want to say, well, this was this and this was very glorious and blah, blah, blah. And then we expect for you to be like, excuse us, but could we also please talk about this, as opposed to saying, hey, wait a minute, there's also this. Let's look at this. Let's give this a yank. And so I don't necessarily believe that the perspective of the people who have been overlooked should be so gently introduced. We've expected you to be gentle and polite for a really long time. And we get really offended when you're not gentle and polite about anything. Hey, could we just talk about this for a minute? As opposed to, like, say, Stokely Carmichael or Malcolm X, or somebody who's like, hey, we need to talk about this right now. You need to shut up and listen to what we're talking about. You know, we've told you to shut up and just listen to what we've said for a really long time. And so when you know, the 1619 project is on everybody's mind right now, but in the grand scheme of things, it's a small thing. I mean, it's just one thing. And so I don't have a problem with it just giving a good hearty yank in the other direction, because that's the way context works, and that's the way conversation works. And so the fact that it's giving a good pull and saying, but look, there's this other thing as well. I don't believe that people of color should be expected to be gentle anymore. or that we are supposed to say, like, we're not going to listen to you unless you're polite about what you say. I think the time for that is kind of past. We can get back to politeness if you want at some point, but you know, not everybody. There's a difference between Stokely Carmichael and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. You know, there's all these prongs that have, you know, they're everybody chose a different way, and then everybody carved out a different path, and it all went forward. So I think that that's perfectly fine to do. I think that a lot of times paradigms don't shift unless people are sort of rather badly jarred in one direction or another. And so the fact that people are kind of jangled out of complacency works just fine for me.
I think the biggest kind of controversy with the 1619 project is that, you know, the people that are against it, it's one of those things where if you agree with whether or not slavery is still shaping our present America, or should I say the effects of slavery, and whether or not that still shapes our present America and the experiences of people of color. And so if you subscribe to that, you know, then what a lot of what the principles and foundation of what the 1619 project is speaking about, then you might find validity towards that. But if you're not one of those people that subscribes to the fact that that this nation, especially the South and wealth and everything, was built on the backs of Black people that were enslaved and when they were brought here, and how that fundamentally, you know, put them at a disadvantage moving forward, that we see the effects of still today. And if you don't look at it through that lens, and you don't see how that affected and continues to affect people of color, then you have an issue with it. In my opinion, I think that's the biggest piece that they're fighting against, is because they don't agree with, you know, which lens to look at it through. I believe that everyone, they can look at the principles of, you know, teaching the history from, you know, when slavery began, but where it took us and how it affects our present day America is a different story.
Well, people don't like to feel implicated, but that doesn't mean that they aren't implicated. I mean, it's not really just somebody's opinion that the effects of slavery and the effects of the Jim Crow era have continued to shape the American experience for you and for us. I mean, I could say I don't really like to hear about gravity because I don't like falling, but the fact is it exists, you know, and we're trying to educate people about the fact that it does exist. There's a lot of people who don't like to hear about that because we think I'm not racist, so therefore I don't want to feel implicated in issues that continue to affect another race detrimentally and maybe even affect me, giving me advantages. But that's what the point of making this information available is. We can't make new decisions unless we see this information. And there are still going to be people who don't want to read it and don't want to look at it. And okay, I mean, I guess they don't have to, but whether or not that should be taught in schools, made available to children, made available to students of all ages, I think is really the issue here. These things are facts. It is a fact that slavery and this racial inequity continues to affect people of color detrimentally in all walks of life every day. We do not have the luxury or the right to disregard this and move on as if it is not true. We simply do not have that right. And so I don't care if people don't like to hear that. I don't like to hear unpleasant things. I don't like to hear that sugar is bad for me and vegetables are good. So I don't like to hear things that aren't fun for me, but the fact is that if I want to be a better person who makes better decisions for myself and the people around me, I have to hear these things. I don't have the right to just continue on and ignore them because they're not pleasant for me.
I agree. I think one of the problems with, history is it is through whose lens, is writing what's going on. I mean, and there are different ways to write history, and I don't know, what we all can agree on is that history needs to be more inclusive than it has been. I mean, the person who has the most books written about him or her or him, other than Jesus Christ, has been who? No, want to take a guess? Who has the most books written about?
Bill Gates.
David Bowie.
Focus. No. No. Abraham Lincoln had 15,000 books written about him. You figure, after the first 10, you figure they probably covered everything about him, but no, there has been more written about him. My point of bringing that up is that 15,000 books about Abraham Lincoln. Can you imagine how many books can be written just focusing on the word history? What part of history do you want to focus on, and how you can dissect it? And I mean, how do you begin to rectify what has already been done in terms of books have excluded a lot of people and has been, hasn't been really honest about, what the true history is. I mean, when I was growing up, the only thing I read about Blacks is one, Nat Turner. Nat Turner was, and that was designed to show how bad, or scared, or to justify, why Blacks still should be, at that time, were bad news. So.
And Beth, you say that these things are fact, and forgive me, I'm really trying to look at all sort of sides of this thing and go outside of myself and stuff. But you say certain things are facts, like, and forgive me, I have a child in the background. But you say it's facts that slavery still affects Black people today, but you'd have a large group of Blacks who say that doesn't. Like, I've moved on. I've been able to succeed just fine from where I am and whatnot. And that it only affects me from what I've learned of it, but I haven't seen any of that in my life, and so what is sort of a fact, is it something that's measurable? And then when we go to it, I don't think you'd be able to go, yes, this was directly linked to slavery. But again, this is why we sort of have this discussion. But it was just interesting that you brought that up. And you also talk about the sort of overcorrection, I call it, of, because we can't get to that middle ground, right? Because if we're in sort of a debate, if you say something that is the opposite of what I'm saying, and you make a good point, if I'm trying to win a debate, I can't just go, oh yeah, you're right, because that middle ground is where a lot of people are very fearful. But that middle ground is sort of where we all actually kind of are in a lot of these areas, because if white people go, oh yes, we were terrible to Black people from day one, and of course it affects them now. Like, what does that mean for them? You know, we sort of talk about poor whites during the Civil War fighting for keeping slavery, even though they were never going to own a slave. Well, they were also fighting for not being the lowest person on the totem pole. So a lot of this is sort of fearful, and so I think that it's going to be hard to ever find that middle ground, because there does need to be this overcorrection, and then people go, well, you're being ridiculous because look at how far over here you are. This has been the status quo for so long, and you're trying to go way over here. And it's like, well, we have to in order to sort of bring about change and get to that middle ground. But that's what shuts people down. You know, that's what shuts down the listening from other people, is like, okay, well, you're being basically an extremist right now, you know, what people are saying. So I just found those comments interesting of fact, and to also kind of highlight what you were saying about what I call like an overcorrection. I found it really interesting.
Well, I think that's the making sure that people learn history, because one of the aspects of history is that it works as a pendulum, and that pendulum swings too far in either direction in order to gather those who do not wish to move, or who are fearful, or who are not activists. It is unfair always to ask farmers to beat their plowshares into swords and to take up arms. That there are people who cannot or will not fight, and it is unfair. Not everybody's a warrior. And so, like, in order to teach people, you know, don't panic. Things have to go kind of far in either direction before we get back to the place where everybody can relax in what is a new configuration. That's teaching history. That's educating people. We have lost the ability, instead of teaching history as the memorization of facts, we must always teach history as a context for critical thinking and the understanding of nuance. And we're not doing that now. What we're doing is saying, can you just tell us, what year was the Edict of Nantes, and what day did this happen? Okay, and then you just blarp back, well, this is what Juneteenth means. Okay, but what happened after Juneteenth? What happened when you could not, you didn't have the right to vote, you couldn't have a white man arrested for killing you or raping your wife or any of those things? What does Juneteenth actually mean? So there's all of these little data points in history, but unless we understand the meaning of them and understand where they were on the road to this next thing, then we lose the meaning of history, and we're not being taught critical thinking. Our children are not being taught critical thinking, and this is what's very important, I think, is that in order to not be frightened by these pendulum swings, you have to understand how history does and always has worked. It has always worked with those pendulum swings. It just is. That's what happens always. So I think we need to change how we educate our children.
Do you think that history is closer to philosophy than something like math, since it's so like subjective?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yes. I think math is this perfect portrait of the mind of God. That's my personal feeling about math, but I also hate math and would like to only read books. But yeah, I mean, I think that you can't accurately, you can memorize historical events, but you can't interpret history without philosophy.
Yeah.
And that's what critical thinking is. And I think that they're inextricably intertwined. And depending on what philosopher you're listening to, the interpretation of the historical fact, but that's, more information, read more books. I mean, Ta-Nehisi Coates, when he in Between the World and Me, talks about, that he went to, like every day he would go to the library and ask for 3 books from 3 different Black philosophers so that he could understand their point of view. And what he discovered was that they were not all on the same page. they were arguing amongst themselves, and one would say one thing and then he would come back the next day and the other person would say another thing, and that is the mark of a thorough education and an agile mind, being able to hold contradicting ideas, and be aware that both of them have merit.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think that that's my overall point, is I think that we should restructure how we frame why we're teaching history, because it seems to be framed, at least again, when I was going to school, like a mathematics, like this is what this is. Like how you're saying is, here's a date, remember this date. When was the, Declaration of Independence and all that, when was that created? As opposed to, we're using this as a tool for creative thinking and going into understanding why history isn't as clear cut and black and white. As William was saying, 1 + 1 is 2 everywhere, but history is nothing like that. But you go to school and it's like, these are the subjects we're learning. And like I said, math and science have principles that are concrete and factual and based off of empirical data, whereas history is not. But they're not really separated, at least not early on in schools, as this is a different thing, and I saw somebody in the comments say that their child is learning, they aren't taught history, they're taught mathematics and science and speech and whatnot. But I think that's my overall sort of push, is that history needs to be taught as framed differently than it is now.
Can I challenge that for a minute? You're saying that history should be taught differently. If I'm understanding it, your point, you're saying that history should be more of a thought exercise, right? So that it's not a collection of facts. And so therefore, the importance of history would be in one's ability to think agilely about it, open-minded. Am I picking that up right?
Yes.
Okay. So let me challenge that for a second and say, doesn't history also serve a cultural function? And what I mean by that is, if we don't have a shared past or a shared idea of the past, isn't it that much more difficult for us to have a shared idea of the future?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then how does that jive with your idea that it's not just a collection of facts, and that we have to treat it as a thought exercise, which would tend to make history then malleable, right? History would be kind of like morals are now, in which it is what we bring to it and what it means to us as individuals, as opposed to its unifying aspect. How does that jive?
Well, I mean, I would think that morals sort of play that same role in where we're going. If we're saying that this is where we're trying to get to as a culture, and we say murder is wrong in most cases, that we're saying that we all sort of agree on morals. But when you break down morals, you just look at the political climate right now. Any way that it's spun, like violence is not okay, but it's okay here. Destruction of property isn't okay here, but it's okay here.
But that happens when we stop having a single shared definition of it, right? And so if I'm hearing you correctly, you seem to be suggesting that we should abandon the idea of a single shared interpretation of history, and that's what I'm asking. How does that jive then?
We absolutely have to abandon a shared idea. I mean, the only shared idea is that more information gives you the ability to interpret individual situations and understand that there are more than one way to view them, and that critical thinking is the only way to reach any kind of consensus. But you're never going to ever have everybody agree on any single data point. But education teaches you that there's more than one way to see everything.
So let's take, for instance, let me go back to a point, and maybe this will help. Beth, you brought up, and it's a point I've been ruminating on. You mentioned, the fact of that slavery impacts all Blacks today negatively. And I heard Gabriel kind of challenge, is that really a fact? And so I wanted to challenge just a little bit further on that idea, because one question I had is that really slavery and its legacy that is holding back Blacks, or is it really the focus on slavery and its legacy that is holding back the Black community? And the reason I ask that is because when I look back, there are some, and I'll confess to my own bias as being one of those, when I look back at the Black community post Reconstruction, in the midst of undeniably systemic racism, and yet you saw more Black professionals, Black communities like Rosewood, the Greenwood community in Tulsa, Black communities like Mound Bayou in Louisiana, who were completely self-sufficient. And you don't really see a self-sufficient Black community today. So the question I have in my mind, and I'm posing to you on that, is how do we reconcile this idea that the legacy of slavery is holding back the Black community today, and yet the Black community who lived closer to that legacy were able to thrive in ways that we don't see happening in the Black community today?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, I thought I'd start with you.
Okay, well, I mean, what happened to those communities? So they were allowed to thrive for a while, and then they were, terrible atrocities happened to them. And so, sure, there's nothing that keeps any individual person of color from thriving. They're as intelligent as anybody else. They have as many abilities as anybody else. They benefit from education in the same ways. They have when they have the same resources, they use them in the same ways. So sure. But Tulsa is a perfect example of that. They had that for a while, and then it was ripped from them in the most brutal possible way. And so again, they were not allowed to thrive for long. And because we didn't really want that to happen. So, maybe the word fact isn't correct. It feels like a fact to me that the residue of slavery and of racism continues to affect the Black community in a detrimental way. I don't think that holding back is exactly always the correct, but it does directly affect. It puts obstacles in the path. Whether or not individual people of any color can get around an obstacle is an individual thing. There are plenty of people of color who will say, I don't have any problem with that. But there are other people who are like, it's right in front of me, I can't go any further. Look at the prison industrial complex. That tells you that there are a lot of people that are not able to transcend those obstacles. And so, yeah, sure, there are ways for people to succeed, but those places, that success was taken away from them.
All right, I'm going to go. We have a question or comment from Moreland again, so we're going to go and open up the mic. Moreland, you're on.
Okay. I guess you guys have been talking about history, and I guess the way I would see it is, yeah, it's studies of dates. It's also, I guess, facts. But it's also accounts. And I would argue that in what you're saying, I would say that the white community suffers far more than even the Black community, because history is incomplete the way it is without things like the 1619 Project. And when you look at certain things like Black Lives Matter or Breonna Taylor, and you start going back to those verdicts and everything else, I know in a lot of discussions I have with others, it's like, well, it's really sad, that happened, but it's the system. And, I just don't know what to do. But as you go back and you start talking about these injustices, and they are, in a lot of cases, they're like, well, yeah, that was wrong, and this was wrong, and this was wrong. And you're like, okay, well, if it's the system, why does the system always do that? And the answer usually for me is like, they have this blank look on their face, like, well, I don't know. And I think as African Americans, a lot of us do have that history, so we know why the system is that way. So there's like this, I guess, like a black hole where information just doesn't come out because the history that we have or the history that we're taught is incomplete with all those accounts and everything else. And because it's incomplete, especially when you get to the social sciences, law and everything else, I think because that's incomplete, we have problems, and those problems aren't solved because we don't have a history of how that, at least the decision makers don't necessarily take history into account fully in terms of how those things started, because they have, I guess somebody was saying, history's written by the winner. So you have that viewpoint, but for us, since we are a melting pot, and we do have, different diversities and everything else, you need to know all of those histories in order to solve the problems that come up. So, just teaching facts, or just teaching dates, or just going over somebody's account of something, each one of those things individually, or, only cherry picking certain portions, that leaves out a lot of things that I guess it's fine as kids to learn certain dates, like in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But as you get to be an adult, and as you start to deal with people more than just yourself, when you deal with an organization, or you deal with cities, or you deal with, people from different countries, if you don't have that history or that timeline, I don't think it's an African American thing. I just think that you lose the ability to successfully solve problems. And I don't know what you guys think. I guess I would ask you. I'm good.
All right. The question's been posed.
Yeah, again, I think that even breaking it up into history, into like sort of factual dates, and then history as a critical thinking exercise, again, sort of addresses that, because there is sort of need for both, an understanding of how a timeline goes and what events happened, but then, why are some people considered great, and what is their place in history, and why, and like having that be a critical thinking point.
I think that there are facts, and some of them are pretty indisputable, that there are certain aspects of systemic racism that started back during the time of slavery that have carried on to our lives today, that have made it more difficult for the African American community to succeed at the same level as the white community. Things such as the redlining, things such as lending practices from banks. All these things have made it more difficult. And so when you have people that say, well, you guys have the same amount of ability to succeed as anyone else in this country, that is true to a certain extent, but a lot of the times the people that are successful have to be even more great in their ability, not to pick on any or particular presidents or anything like that, but we've had presidents that were C students according to what their grades were, that got into Ivy League schools. And if you don't have those connections, like being a legacy or any of that, as an African American, you're not going to get into an Ivy League school with C grades. And so the opportunities are not equalized across the board, which is what the issue is, and why, you know, why people of color kind of push back against the system, and they speak about this systemic racism. You shouldn't have to go to 20 different banks in order to get a business loan, when you have the same qualifications as a white applicant. But because, you know, these they have this thing on these books and a lot of banks in the banking industry, where they set up a criteria that that they assign points to, whether part of it is your income, part of it is your educational history, but there is a racial aspect to it, that people in certain ethnic groups are penalized because of statistics and things like that, based off of what their lending histories have been for certain banks in certain areas. But they don't look at it as just your individual. You know, I'm an individual. What if Gabe had defaulted on a loan? How does that reflect against me? I'm not Gabe. And they do that to people of color, but they don't do that to white people. And so, you know, when we talk about systemic racism and how it hinders success for particularly the African American community, you know, we have to look at it through those lenses, and not just, you know, well, people are being racist, you know, or saying bad things, or yes, slavery has long been gone, but the effects of it still carry on. And until we get to a point where we have people agreeing that it exists and it does carry over to now, then we will never be able to move forward with making it right. You know, just the implicit biases that people have in hiring people. You know, it's a fact that people with African American sounding names get interviewed at 50% less of a rate. You know, just things like that.
Any additional comments to that?
I mean, what Bootsy is saying is, oh, sorry, Beth, go ahead.
No, okay, go ahead.
No, I'll concede to you.
No, I really, I didn't have anything that interesting to say. You should go on.
Yeah. So I was sitting there processing what was being said, and what we are talking about is just what Bootsy was talking about is institutional racism. People are asking, well, what is that? The reality is that we do start from a negative point. In other words, you know, going to a bank, we have to go to many more, you know, because we're not, you know, we are not part of the network, if you will, the good old boy network and stuff. And so I know when I applied for the stimulus money for my practice, hell, I didn't get it because, you know, I wasn't connected to that bank, and I've been banking there for like 20 years, but somebody else, you know, but they had already given to the people that they knew. I think we see that in other institutions in which just it's how people think of things, and it's not just, you know, whites that have misperception. I think blacks also. A lot of them never going back to looking at their own history. A lot of them don't know their history. wasn't taught to them, nor did they find the interest to go and look at it, but yet they're impacted by that institutional racism every day. And yes, slavery did have an impact on Blacks because I mean, because we see it being played out day after day after day. I know. I know that it is it's one of those things that's hidden. That unless, I mean, now we're being made aware of it, but you know, for a while we've been asleep for quite some time, and I can't say things that have happened to us, meaning Blacks. I think it's happened to us because we weren't aware of what was going on with us. I mean, we were not made aware of, you know, like when they talk about riots or because we're speaking out, there's a lot of people, including the Black community, that were, you know, were critical of, you know, like the Black Panthers, who were saying that the police were actually hired killers. You know, we're saying that way back then, you know, that the police, you know, that our government was setting up, you know, Blacks to fail, you know, and even our own kind was even, you know, saying, geez, we shouldn't riot. I mean, even it's not a riot if white people come out with guns and stuff like that, but certainly it's a riot when Black people get together or brown people get together and do that, you know. And what's triggering that? Institutional racism, because, you know, I asked the person, hey, who is, you know, when you think of people on welfare, you know, there are more white people on welfare than there are Black, but they immediately think there's Black. Why? Because of institutional racism. So what I see, you know, you know, so when Boots was talking about, you know, we have to, why do we have to do more, you know, just be on equal footing? A lot of that has to do with, you know, for me, you know, it begins with how people perceive what, you know, we as Blacks are capable, or and how we're made to feel, or we are portrayed to be ignorant. So,
well, of course, because, you know, this is becoming sort of less and less, but you look at the sources of information that we have. You know, before there was only a few sources of information, and so of course there's going to be Black people who have that same perception, because we're sort of getting the same information. You know, you talk about welfare, people thinking about Black people. That's because, you know, there was these characterizations or welfare queens, you know, and so that's what people saw. So that's what they associated with, regardless of if more white people are on welfare than Black people. You know, all of these stereotypes have been built up. So if you're not directly in that community, you're getting fed basically the same news. Of course, now there's a million different news sources and social media, which is it's interesting, because now you're getting information from people who you typically agree with, and so you're only seeing like one sort of thing. But before, like, how many different, you know, in the 70s and 80s, there was less variety of news sources, and so you're getting the same, like, entertainment, the same stereotypes, the same perception, all coming from one pipeline, you know. And so absolutely, of course, people are going to even other African Americans are going to have that same sort of perception. And so but that's just to kind of address what you were saying, Mal. And yeah, go ahead, Bootsy. I see you unmuted.
No, I was just going to say, I agree with one of your points about that the news sources have increased dramatically since, you know, even the 90s or whatever, because of the internet. And so now, you know, we have so many more sources. And then also with the, you know, the advent of social media, we're not only hearing it from credible sources, but we're also hearing it other people's opinions. And so, you know, we have this kind of collision of ideas versus facts versus opinion. And now it's hard to kind of sift through to what exactly is right. And so, you know, kind of get back on what we were talking about, how are things like the 1619 project, is it bringing us closer to what the truth is versus not true? I think what you said originally is, you know, that it is bringing us somewhere in the middle. And the only reason I say that we're somewhere in the middle with this is because there's so many conflicting ideas and messages being pushed. And, you know, we can't get to a common consensus on, you know, what exactly is, what is fact that is being drawn into what it has shaped America as far as what they're discussing in a lot of those articles, as opposed to what is someone's just opinion, or what is this misinformation that's, you know, that's being provided, and how people are looking at things. And so I think that, you know, discussion obviously is one way to kind of clear it up, but you know, we need to get to that a level where we have I know we have fact checkers and things like that. They, you know, fact check people even on Facebook nowadays and all that. But when we get to a point in society where we can get a more of a common consensus of, you know, where our information is coming from, then we can, you know, start moving past a lot of this misinformation. But I don't think that that's anywhere close to our future. I think it's just going to get more muddied and more, you know, kind of convoluted ideas and opinions that we're going to run into, because everyone thinks that they're right. And, you know, who's to tell someone that their opinion's wrong?
Well, didn't the woman that started the 1619 project just get a Pulitzer Prize? Is it a Pulitzer Prize or a Nobel Prize? I can't remember, but I mean, there is a general consensus by learned bodies that she is at least, you know, that she is presenting good information. You know, we have to ask who's vetting the information about what's right and what's wrong, and what's correct and what's not. But she's certainly, I wish I could remember her name right now. I just can't. But there certainly are august bodies of intellect who have decided that she's done something good and is presenting some valuable information. I mean, there is vetting of information, and now that's kind of the problem with so many, you know, sources of news or narrative, that not all of it is vetted. But then back in the day, there were very few sources of news and narrative, and they were presenting, you know, a much narrower perspective, and there wasn't a way to get another perspective out where anyone could see it.
Yeah, she won a Pulitzer Prize for commentary.
Okay, yes.
And for the record, her name is Nicole Hannah Jones.
Thank you, sorry. I'm sorry to not remember that. I'm terrible at names sometimes.
No problem. You know, it's been a great discussion. We are coming up on the close of our time, so I think that's going to be the last comment today. As usual, we've had a great panel, great discussion, and I want to thank each of you for taking the time out today to be on the panel. I know it can be kind of stressful to be up here and expressing opinions, Bootsy, thanks for joining us. Beth, as always, great job. Thanks for joining us again. And Melvin and Gabe, thanks for coming back again and sharing your ideas. Much appreciated. For the audience, again, thank you for taking time out joining us today. Hope that you'll come back again on the last weekend of the month. Next month's topic, we're going to talk about policing and race and policing and bias in policing. So hope you'll join us for that. I think that's a very important discussion and one I'm sure will generate a lot of conversation, and we'll have some great panelists on for that discussion as well. Just a reminder that UNP itself, who's presenting these shows, is a nonpartisan group, and we certainly would like your support. So please check us out on Facebook. Check out our blog at www.unitixnotpolitics.com, and check out our YouTube channel as well. Unitix, by the way, is spelled UNITICS. Again, if you'd like to join one of these panels, please drop us a line at information@unitixnotpolitics.com. I think I got that right. I think it's info@Unitix. And if you look in the chat, our producer, who is a lot more on top of it than I am, is putting those links in there. So please check us out there. And again, we're always looking for additional panelists. So if you'd like to come on, express your ideas, drop us a line, and we'll reach out to you. With that in mind, just a couple of closing thoughts. Hopefully you enjoyed the discussion. And one thing that you see with these is that there's a lot of diversity of opinion, not only when we talk about right and left spectrum, obviously there's diversity there, but even when you talk about people who generally agree overall, you see that how we come to those agreements and how we form our thoughts is different. And that diversity is really what should be the strength of America. And the real danger that we have right now in our conversations around politics has to do with the binary way of thinking, that in order for me to be right and in order for me to feel the way I feel, you must be wrong in the way that you feel. And what we hope in these conversations is to show that when we talk to each other and we get past all the name calling and we get past the labeling and we approach these conversations with genuine curiosity, genuine intellectual curiosity and openness, that we can actually build bridges. We can actually come to understand these differences and points of view. And what we tend to find when that happens is they're really not so different after all. That most of us, when we are forming our opinions, start from a place in which we want the best, and we start from a place of good faith, and we're looking for what we think is the best for our families, for ourselves, and for our country as well. And if we can bring that attitude into these conversations, you see that also we can express those different points of view and yet still come away, even when we still disagree, doing so in an agreeable fashion. And that's an important thing for a democracy. So it's a political season in which we're campaigning for a national vote. I urge everyone to get out and vote. I don't care which way you want to vote, whether you're voting on Democrat or Republican. Get out there and vote. Make sure that your voice is heard, and then come back and join us at Unitix Not Politics, and let's continue the discussion on how we'll hold the people that we elect accountable, because in the end, that's really what we are about, because this country belongs to us, not to our politicians. And in order for us to make sure that we are able to exercise our rights in the future, we have to protect them by holding our politicians accountable. So vote and come back and join us again next month, and we'll talk again. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Have a great weekend. Have a great month, and we'll see you again. Bye.